If you spend enough time in the Victorian high country, eventually someone will tell you the story, and it usually happens at night. Maybe you camp beside one of the rivers, the fire burning low, while the mountains disappear into blackness all around you. Maybe you're sitting in the corner of an old pub somewhere, like Dargo or Mansfield, while rain falls steadily on the roof outside. The person telling you this yarn won't rush it. They'll lean back, stare into the fire for a moment, and start by describing the valley itself. They'll tell you the Wonnangatta Valley sits deep in the mountains, isolated, even now, and that in the early 1900s it was about as far from civilization as you could get in Victoria. And then they'll tell you about the two men who were living in that valley, all alone, Jim Barclay and John Bamford. After that, though, the details start to change depending on who's telling the story. Some people say the whole thing started with cattle thieves. Others say it was a story as old as time, a disagreement over a woman. Some will swear that the killers were known from the very beginning, but nobody wanted to speak openly. Every version, however it's told, whoever's telling it, does include some key details. One summer, early 1900s, both of those men, Jim Barclay and John Bamford, vanished. And what happened afterwards became one of the oldest unsolved mysteries in Australian history. More than a century later, people are still telling this story. It's the mystery the high country never let go of. The Wonnangatta murders. G'day, welcome back to Strewth. I'm your storyteller Mark, and tonight I'm going to give you my version of this tale. A combination of the newspaper reports, the folklore, and the theories that have appeared in a shelf load of books that have been written about it over the years. And at the end of today's episode, I've got a special bonus just for you, the amazing listeners of Strewth. So make sure you stick around for that. So sit back, pretend you're staring into that campfire, or looking up at the stars, or perhaps nursing a pot of beer that's rapidly emptying in front of you. We're going to try and figure out once and for all what happened to Jim Barclay and John Bamford. There's something about isolation that changes people. The further you move from towns, from rules, from witnesses, the more self-reliant you become. Isolation also changes the way communities behave. People learn not to ask too many questions. They learn when to stay quiet. And in the early 20th century, the Wonnangatta Valley sat at the far edge of civilization. The homestead rested near the junction of the Wonnangatta River and Conglomerate Creek, surrounded by mountains, huge ash trees in every direction. It was beautiful country, but deeply unforgiving. Floods could trap you, bushfires could corner you, snow could isolate you for weeks. And if somebody wanted to disappear out there, or make somebody disappear, they had all the space in the world. The station itself had existed since the 1860s. Over the decades it had become a working cattle property, changing hands several times, before eventually being owned by businessman Arthur Phillips and his partner, Richie. But the people who owned Wonnangatta rarely visited there. The job of surviving this isolation fell to the station manager, and by 1915 that man was Jim Barclay. If you listen carefully to the old accounts of Jim Barclay, one detail comes up again and again. People respected him, not because he was gentle or charming, but because he was capable. And in the high country, nothing about a bloke mattered more. Barclay had been born in Hastings on Victoria's Mornington Peninsula in 1869. He grew up rough. School records mention fights. There was even an incident involving fire and police attention when he was young. But bush communities in colonial Victoria were hard places, and hard boys often became the sort of hard men you wanted working for you. Eventually, following gold, Barclay drifted north toward the high country. But when the prospecting didn't pan out as he'd hoped, he worked wherever work existed. Shearing, fencing, contract labour, and finally his true calling, working with cattle. By the early 1900s, he'd established himself around Mansfield as an experienced bushman and cattleman. And then, as it has a tendency to do, life hit him hard. In 1910, he married a 19-year-old woman named Lizzie Cantiani. Within a year, she was dead from tuberculosis. Their son, Jim Jr., or Young Jim as he was often referred to, was still just an infant. Friends later said that Barclay never really recovered, not mentally at least. He buried himself in work. And so when the chance came to manage Wonnangatta Station, he took it, and Jim Jr. was sent off to the city to live with relatives. For nearly 3 years, Barclay lived in that valley with only occasional visitors. A mail delivery here or there, some stockmen passing through. That was life. Long periods alone. And by all accounts, he handled it well. In fact, he thrived in it. The station itself flourished on the back of Jim's hard work and skill with cattle, so much so that by late 1917, he needed to hire a new station hand to keep up with the increase in activity. He hired a man by the name of John Bamford, and according to almost every version of the story, that is when the trouble started. John Bamford was 61 years old when he rode into Wonnangatta, and that alone stands out. Most men doing hard station work in the mountains were much younger, but labour at the time was scarce. Australia was still fighting the First World War, and rural communities had been stripped of young men, so you took whoever you could get. And Bamford, by all accounts, was a bottom-of-the-barrel type of character. He came with a reputation. Locals who knew him around Talbotville and Blacksnake Creek described him as bad-tempered, difficult, and some stories painted him as genuinely dangerous. One rumour, impossible to verify, even suggested he'd murdered his wife years earlier. And it's important to remember at this stage that high country gossip has a habit of growing larger every time it's repeated. But even so, several people reportedly warned Barclay not to argue with Bamford. And where there's smoke, there's fire. Still, desperate and perhaps not giving any weight to the gossip of locals, Barclay did hire Bamford, and for a while everything appeared normal. On the 20th of December 1917, Barclay and Bamford rode into Talbotville together to vote in the second conscription referendum. The country was divided at the time over compulsory military service. The two men stayed overnight at Albert Stout's store, Harry Smith, Barclay's closest neighbour and good mate, although they were 40 miles apart, also saw them while they were in town. Nothing about Barclay at the time seemed unusual to Smith. They chatted about crops back at Wonnangatta that wouldn't be ready for cutting until mid-January. Ordinary talk amongst farmers. And the next morning the two men rode back toward the valley. And that was the last confirmed sighting of either man alive. Although Smith reported Barclay seeming relatively normal on that trip to Talbotville, there is one part of this tale that does matter. Before he disappeared, Jim Barclay was frightened. Not uneasy, not cautious. He was frightened. He wrote a letter to his brother saying, "I wish you were here with me. I really need you, brother." He reportedly told a friend he'd received threatening letters, although he never discussed exactly what they were about. He was so frightened, in fact, that he went to Mansfield and bought himself a revolver, a Harrington and Richardson. And according to people who knew him at this time, he carried it, loaded, on his person at all times. Jim Barclay was not a timid man. He'd spent decades working in remote, harsh country. He knew violence, he knew danger. For somebody like that to suddenly arm himself constantly suggests he believed something serious was coming. But no one knew at the time just how serious that something was going to turn out to be. On January 22nd, Harry Smith rode into Wonnangatta carrying Barclay's mail. Smith is one of those figures who feels almost fictional. An old high country cattleman living nearby at Eaglevale Station. He was tough, quiet, deeply familiar with the mountains. The sort of man who could disappear into the bush for days without concern. And he and Barclay were close friends. Smith regularly carried mail into the valley, an excuse perhaps for a couple of blokes to have some human company for a little while. Smith would always stay the night for a drink and for a feed, to catch up with an old mate. So when he arrived at the homestead and found nobody there, it did feel, to Smith, unusual. Not alarming, not yet, but certainly unusual. In his retelling of events, Smith never mentioned seeing Barclay or Bamford's horses either. In cattle country, horses were everything. So if the horses were gone, it meant, to Smith at least, that the men were most likely out working. The other fact that led Smith to this assumption was that there was a message written on the kitchen door in chalk. It read simply, "Home tonight." And so Harry waited, one night then another, but still nobody returned. Even much later in the tale, when Smith was recalling those couple of days at the homestead, the only thing that he recalled as being slightly odd about the house is that Barclay's bedroom door was locked. The house itself, of course, was open, but the bedroom was locked. And after 2 nights of waiting, Harry decided he needed to return to Eaglevale Station. He rode home. Three weeks later, he returned. A general unease had been sitting with him for those 3 weeks, and by this time he really needed to make contact with his mate Jim Barclay. As he approached Wonnangatta Station, he noted that the atmosphere had changed completely. The mail Smith delivered on his last visit still sat unopened. The message in chalk still hung on the door. Barclay's bedroom door was still locked. And then, from somewhere nearby, he hears something that he was not expecting. It was a dog, thin and weak. Baron, Jim Barclay's dog, his favourite, the one Barclay kept and valued above most things on the property. And amongst everything else that is missing, Baron is still here, still standing his post, alive but barely. Smith's immediate relief at seeing Baron was swamped quickly by the thoughts that followed. If Baron's at home, where's Jim? Why is he not here? Smith then notices something that sent his fear and anxiety into overdrive. Barclay's horse was in the paddock. It too had returned home, found its way into a closed paddock. But Bamford's horse, Thelma, was nowhere to be seen. The valley around him suddenly seemed silent and completely overwhelming. Harry Smith understood something was really wrong. Search parties formed quickly. Arthur Phillips, the property owner, rode in from Mansfield alongside his experienced stockman, Jack Jebb. Together with Harry Smith, they combed the valley, and on February 25th, they found Jim Barclay, partially buried in a shallow grave near Conglomerate Creek, just 420 paces from the homestead. His body was so badly decomposed and ravaged by wild animals that he had to be identified by his belt and tobacco pouch, both of which Harry Smith instantly recognised. Jim Barclay had been shot in the back. The discovery transformed the valley overnight. The speculation and stories caught hold like a bushfire in the middle of summer, whipping through the shearing sheds, the pubs, the local communities at a rapid rate. Before detectives even arrived, people had already decided which of the suspects they believed had been the perpetrator. Naturally, and perhaps justifiably at this point, initial suspicion fell on John Bamford. He was missing. So too was his horse. And he had a reputation for being an aggressive and short-tempered man. And those old unspoken rumours about being the murderer of his own wife were now being openly discussed. From a distance, the explanation made simple sense. Two men alone in an isolated valley. An argument, violence, one man dead, shot in the back, the other fleeing into the mountains on horseback. Detective Alex McCarroll travelled from Melbourne to investigate. He was accompanied by a Constable Ryan, who had grown up in the district and knew the country. McCarroll was smart enough to know that a city slicker such as himself might need a former local beside him, just to build trust with the locals. It was going to be hard to get them to talk, at least to them. Inside the homestead, the detective found signs Barclay was most likely murdered in his bedroom. Barclay's shotgun had been fired recently. An empty cartridge sat by his bed. There also appeared to be drag marks leading outside, in the general direction of where his body ended up, 420 paces from the homestead. Notably, several items were also missing. Barclay's revolver, his razor, and his good suit. These items were removed from Jim Barclay's locked bedroom. So the question we have to ask ourselves at this point is this: how did the perpetrator gain entry? Was the room unlocked and then they locked it after themselves after the event? Or did they know where Barclay kept the key? And there was something else. Something that might hold great significance in this case, but could also be the reddest of herrings. Two policemen who had fixed themselves some eggs while at the property reached for a small tin sitting on the mantelpiece that looked for all money to them like a pepper shaker. And so they shook. But something made them hesitate before they took a bite of those eggs. The colour of this pepper, perhaps, or the smell. It turns out what the tin sitting next to the dining table contained was, in fact, strychnine, often used in these parts as rabbit or dingo poison. Was this just carelessness? Or something far more nefarious? Nobody has ever explained why it was there, and maybe there is an innocent explanation. But stories survive because of details exactly like this one. The poison tin, the locked room, the missing revolver, the starving dog, the message on the door. All of it sounds less like ordinary murder and more like something from folklore, which is probably why people kept retelling it, why people like yours truly retell it still. So where had Bamford gone? That question consumed the early investigation. Police searched widely and sightings came from all across Victoria. At one point, officers arrested a man near Carrum on the Mornington Peninsula who claimed to be Bamford. He turned out to be mentally ill. Another man near Yarram in Gippsland, much closer to Wonnangatta, confessed outright to the murder. Again, another false confession. And meanwhile, the real John Bamford remained missing. Months passed. Winter came and went across the mountains. And then, in November 1918, the case took another turn. Searchers on the Howard High Plains discovered a body beneath a pile of very heavy logs near Howard Hut. It was John Bamford, and he'd been shot in the head. And suddenly the entire case changed, because if Bamford murdered Barclay, who had murdered Bamford? And perhaps even more confusingly, why hide his body beneath logs in one of the most remote parts of the mountains? Logs that by all accounts would have taken more than one man to shift. This most certainly was not suicide, and most likely wasn't a sole perpetrator. The story being told amongst locals again shifted and spread. This new discovery had whipped it up again like a strong wind, bringing embers back to life. The new theories were larger, far more elaborate, with more people now required. Well-kept secrets and a very real fear of repercussions had now woven themselves throughout the telling of the story. But of all the theories, one has probably survived longest around the campfires, and this theory centres on cattle duffers. Stock theft was common in the high country, especially at this time. The terrain made policing almost impossible. Remote valleys, huge distances, scattered cattle. If you knew the country well enough, you could move stolen stock through the mountains without anybody noticing. And there's one key detail that gives this theory real weight. When the owners later sold Wonnangatta Station in 1919, they discovered massive cattle losses. In fact, almost half of their cattle was missing. Far more than can be explained away by rational, non-nefarious reasons. If large-scale stock theft was happening, Barclay, an experienced station manager, would eventually have noticed. And if he did notice that the wrong sort of people were taking his cattle, suddenly his fear makes sense. And so does Bamford's death, for that matter. Because if Bamford witnessed something, he became a problem too. Over time, rumours attached names to this particular theory. The brothers Beveridge were often mentioned. Jack and Sid were described in contemporaneous accounts as renowned cattle thieves from the Buckland area. Stories even circulated about Sid's deathbed confession to a neighbour in his old age that he and his brother were indeed responsible. Another yarn that stuck to the Beveridge name over the years was about Jack Beveridge and his visits to a local woman named Dolly Eccleston for 40 years. The story goes that Jack visited Dolly every Sunday night, and when he made those visits, he was always wearing the distinctive suit that went missing from Jim Barclay's bedroom. Were these true? Maybe, maybe not. But again, That's how the story survives, not as a clean police file. As folklore, fragments pass from one person to another, each storyteller adding a little bit of detail, each listener deciding which version feels more true to them. And then there's the theory people usually lower their voice before mentioning. A woman. Depending on who tells it, the names change slightly. Some believe it to be Anne Klingspawn. Others centre this tale around Anne's sister-in-law, Fanny Klingspawn. But the central idea remains the same. Jim Barclay became involved with the wrong woman, and somebody killed him for it. The names attributed to those responsible in this version are Robert Klingspawn and Jack Ware. Robert is Anne's husband. He is also Fanny's brother. Either way you look at it, you can see why there might be a vested interest in this supposed dalliance. Both Robert and Jack, unlike the Beveridge brothers, were respected local men, not the sort of people police would easily target without evidence. And many historians dismiss this theory completely, mainly due to the standing of the Klingspawn and Ware families in this community. But also because Barclay lived in extraordinary isolation, and maintaining an affair from Wonnangatta Station, well, that would have been very difficult. In addition, Barclay's own family were adamant that Jim quite simply wasn't that sort of bloke. But, alas, the story refused to die, and decades later, it resurfaced in the most extraordinary way. Author Wallace Mortimer once visited Jim Barclay's son, Jim Jr., in his old age. It turns out young Jim had spent years working for Harry Smith in the high country after his father's death at Eaglevale Station next to Wonnangatta. Smith had become a sort of father figure to the orphan boy. The author, Mortimer, who was researching the murders, recalled that Jim Jr. said very little during their discussion at his home in Stratford, East Gippsland. He was guarded. He described the murders as best forgotten and said that both killers were long dead. At the end of their meeting, Jim Jr. walked Mortimer out to his car, and at the end of the driveway, as a parting remark, he said, "You know, Harry Smith told me that the men who killed my father were Robert Klingspawn and Jack Ware." He delivered it quietly, turned, and went back inside. Jim Barclay Jr. died in 1987 at the age of 77. Whatever he knew, or half knew, or had been told by a man who had spent decades keeping the secret, went with him. A man who, whichever way you look at it, was at the centre of this tale. Because the deeper you go into this case, the more central Harry Smith becomes. Because this old bushman sat at the crossroads of everything. He was the one who found the empty homestead in the first place. He was the one who returned for a second time before raising the alarm. He was present when his best mate Barclay was found 420 paces from that homestead. He was also involved in finding Bamford's body. According to some reports, it was on Smith's suggestion that they were searching that particular location on the Howard High Plains to begin with. There was even a rumour that they were there because Smith had said that he dreamt about Bamford's final resting spot. Some people believe that this remarkable demonstration of intuition was possible because, after finding his mate Barclay's body, Smith himself tracked the missing Bamford through the mountains, putting a bullet in his head as revenge for his murdered friend. But remember, we only have Smith's version of events for the 2 visits he made to that property. We don't really know what happened while he was there. What he saw, what he did, what he didn't do. We don't know for sure what happened during the 3 weeks between visits, because Harry Smith lived alone. And perhaps this is why many locals insist that Smith knew the killers from the very beginning, but stayed silent. He never publicly accused anyone, and it was only much later in life that he mentioned Klingsborn and Ware to Jim Jr. Why? Fear is one explanation, because according to people who knew him, Smith carried guns constantly after the murders. He slept with loaded rifles beside his bed. He feared somebody would come for him too, and maybe he had very good reason for that fear. The high country in 1918 was not modern Australia. Police were distant, witnesses were isolated, and if violent men controlled parts of the district, speaking openly could be dangerous. There's another possibility too. Maybe Harry simply lacked proof. Knowing and proving are very different things, especially in a place where physical evidence disappears quickly. Rain, animals, fire, time. The mountains here erase things. Years later, after Harry died, many of his belongings and papers were destroyed in a fire. Those belongings were at Jim Jr.'s house. So if Smith ever wrote down what he suspected, it vanished in that house fire. And once again, the truth slipped further into folklore. Today, the Wonnangatta Valley sits inside the Alpine National Park. The old homestead burned down decades ago. Only traces remain. Stockyards, a small cemetery, open flats beside the river. But the story never disappeared, because people still travel into that country. And when night falls around campfires, when their stomachs are full and the stars fill the sky, somebody eventually brings it up. The 2 men, the shallow grave, the body beneath the heavy logs, the message on the door saying home tonight. And after more than 100 years, nobody can say for certain what happened. Maybe it was cattle thieves. Maybe it was revenge. Maybe jealousy. Maybe it was a combination of the above, and that's why the pieces don't seem to fit. But I think the reason this story survives has less to do with the murders themselves and more to do with what they represent. The high country has always carried an edge to it, a juxtaposition that makes it the perfect setting for a story like this. It is beautiful, breathtaking country, and yet extremely dangerous. We heard it back in episode 8 of Strewth, the story of the Button Man. Another high country yarn carried from one generation to the next. A story that helps explain this country, its remoteness, its silence, the strange feeling that the mountains are hiding something just beyond sight. And like all the great stories born out here, it escaped the people who first told it. It spread through pubs, shearing sheds, campfires, cattle camps, until it became more than a story. It became part of the culture of the high country itself. Storytelling up there isn't just entertainment. It's a rich tradition. And somewhere out there in the Victorian Alps, the truth about the Wonnangatta murders probably died with the people who knew it. And I reckon that's exactly how the high country wanted it. Strewth. Thanks again for listening to another episode of Strewth. A big welcome to all of our new listeners. Plenty of you about, so hopefully you enjoyed this tale as well. It's the podcast, of course, where we tell Australia's most perplexing mysteries. And thanks to all of you who shared the show with a friend, left a rating, followed us, subscribed, whatever it is that you do on your social media platforms and podcasting platforms. I really appreciate it. And as a result of all of that support that you give the show, something really cool happened this week. Strewth snuck into the top 50 of the Spotify True Crime podcast charts for the first time, which, given that we're not even 50 episodes in and just an independent podcast with no external support, is pretty amazing. So I just wanted to thank you, not only with words, but with another little bonus episode that I'm going to tack on to the end of this one. This was one of 3 stories that appeared in an episode on Strewth Premium called The Small Hours, where I told 3 tales about Australians who saw very strange things in the small hours of the morning. So I hope you like it, and if you do want to hear more of this type of thing, make sure you sign up to Strewth Premium on Patreon. You'll find the links in the show notes. This is actually my version of a story that I spotted on the internet about a bloke who went camping in another very isolated part of Australia. West of Julia Creek in Queensland, the land flattens into something almost overwhelming in its scale. The Mitchell grass plains run to every horizon without interruption. There's no hill, no ridge, nothing to give the eye something to rest on. And the sky at night out here is enormous. The stars almost aggressively bright, and the silence is so encompassing it feels like the land itself is holding its breath. Our witness, we'll call him David, was not a nervous man. He was experienced in remote country, a capable camper. The station he was on belonged to a friend of his. It stretched, as properties tend to do out here, for tens of thousands of acres. And David was comfortable in this place, at home on land like this. On this occasion he'd driven out after work on a Friday night with his swag, his camp stove, and his dog, a kelpie. 3 hours of unsealed track, with the ute rattling and his kelpie in the back standing up the whole way, her nose working, reading the country as it changed. She was the kind of dog that takes the outback in her stride, the kind of dog that gives its human a layer of comfort, regardless of the situation. He'd pulled up in the late afternoon beside a dry creek bed, a little shelter from the wind, a fringe of coolabah trees casting long shadows east across the grass. He'd made his camp methodically, without fuss, swag unrolled, fire built in a ring of stones dragged from the creek bed. And he'd cooked over it. Sausages and baked beans, eaten straight from the pan with a fork and a chunk of bread. It's the kind of meal that somehow tastes so much better in a place like this, on a night like this. The dog had sat 3 feet away and watched every bite David made with an unwavering focus, and she was grateful for a couple of snags that were flung away at the end of the meal. By midnight, the fire had settled to coals. The dog was on her side at his feet, one ear twitching now and then at something in the grass, her legs moving faintly in whatever dream working dogs have. David had his back to the coolabah, one knee up, mug of tea balanced on it. He wasn't reading, he wasn't thinking about much. He was just letting that silence do its thing. The cold was starting to come in at his back. The plains lose their heat fast once the sun drops, and the ground itself soon emanates an inescapable chill. He'd been meaning to get up and put more wood on the fire for at least 20 minutes, but he'd not quite got around to it. He was too comfy, and he didn't want to bother the dog. The fire popped and crackled. The dog slept, and the dark, beyond the firelight, was total. All of a sudden the dog sat bolt upright, no bark, no growl, just that sudden rigid attention that a working dog reserves for something it has detected long before any human can. her ears forward, weight forward, eyes fixed on the darkness past the edge of the firelight. David looked up from the flames and in that direction. And he saw a tiny flare of light. It was brief. An orange, perhaps 100 metres out in the dark. It's hard to judge distance in that type of desolation, especially at night. The small wavering bloom of a flame, perhaps being lifted to a cigarette, cupped in a hand, and then extinguished. And then, nothing. David sat very still. The logical explanations assembled themselves readily enough. A stockman out for a late smoke, perhaps. Some itinerant who'd found a camp spot and was keeping a respectful distance. He called out, but nothing answered. The night around him absorbed the sound, but the dog had not relaxed. David, too, fully alert now, rebuilt the fire and watched that darkness. Half an hour passed. He's precise about this, certain of it because he kept checking his watch. 30 minutes during which nothing moved, nothing made a sound beyond the fire and the insects and the very occasional trembling of his dog at his feet. And then the smell arrived. Cigarette smoke. Drifting on a still, entirely windless night. Not faint, present, close. The unmistakable waft of someone actively smoking just nearby. David was on his feet before he'd consciously decided to move. His hand instinctively found the rifle in the dark beside the swag, and before he knew it, he was standing with the torch in his left hand and the rifle in his right. The quiet enabling him to hear his own heart pounding in his chest, the torch beam cutting out across the dark. It shone across grass, the pale trunks of the coolabahs, the dry creek bed beyond. But nothing else, at least no one. He held the beam steadily and listened. The dog was on her feet now, pressed hard against his leg, and she wasn't making a sound. And this was somehow worse than if she'd been barking. A dog that barks has decided the thing it's barking at is at a manageable distance. It's giving a warning. But a dog that goes silent and presses hard against you has decided something else entirely. He called out, his voice completely ineffective in all that open space. He'd never felt so small. The sound was swallowed immediately by the dark and the flat country stretching away in every direction. No answer came back. He gave it 30 seconds, a minute. The torch beam moved slowly across the same ground, finding nothing new. So he started loading the ute. Not panicking. He was precise about this when he told the story later, but moving without hesitation. Swag first, stove, the camp kit. He was working fast and quiet. No sound except the soft thud of the gear going into the tray and the dog's claws on the steel as he lifted her in. The fire had dropped to almost nothing now, and the dark was very close. He kept the torch clamped under his arm the whole time, beam out, the rifle leaning against the rear wheel, within reach. It was almost done. One last glance, he thought. And another match flared. He stopped moving. Every muscle in his body stopped at once. The torch dropped to his side. He stood completely still with the tailgate half latched in his hands. It wasn't 100 metres away this time. It was 50, maybe, tops. The fire was nearly dead and the 50 metres was very close. Too close. It was the same motion as before, but he was sure he got it right now. The brief orange bloom, two cupped hands sheltering the flame. The deliberate drawing of it to the cigarette tip. It was unhurried, precise. Performed with the patience of someone who had been standing out there in the dark for a long time and was in no particular hurry to do anything different. It dawned on David at this point that whoever was out there was not hiding. They'd let him hear the first match, let him smell the smoke drifting in on a windless night. And now, as he stood half-packed with his hands on the tailgate and his rifle right next to him, they still let him see the second one. But they were closer now, and they weren't answering when he called. David put his dog in the car and drove to the station house. He spent the rest of the night inside, with the lights on, the dog by his side. He plucked up the courage to go back in the morning. He tells this part of the story carefully, the way people tell a story that they've considered thoroughly and frequently. The light was good. He knew exactly where he'd been standing when he saw the first match flare, because he'd marked it against the tree line before he drove away. Even in that moment, he'd been fully intending to return to get some answers. He'd moved to the far edge first, the place where the light had appeared when it was still 100 metres out, and he worked inward from there in slow passes, a methodical search grid. He found the first lot of butts just about exactly where he'd expected them. 3 in total, pressed into the earth. The paper still dry, it hadn't rained the night before. At first there was an element of relief in the discovery. At least he hasn't imagined the whole thing. But then the stark reality of the situation began to set in. Who was watching him? Why? Where had they come from, and how on earth could they approach with no sound? This was not a location that was within walking distance of anything. And then he moved to the closer position, the 50-metre mark, where the second match had flared, while his hands were on the tailgate. More butts, 2 this time. Whoever had been there had smoked 3 cigarettes at the first position, and then, at some point while David was loading his ute, had moved to within 50 metres and smoked 2 more, completely undeterred by the fact that David had clearly noticed them and was waving a rifle around. But perhaps most puzzlingly of all, he did not find a single footprint. There was none approaching either position, and none retreating from them either. There was nothing connecting them to each other, no track between the 100-metre mark and the 50-metre mark. No evidence of the movement that must have happened between the first light and the second. The soil held everything else. The pressed circles where David's swag pegs had gone in, the scuff of his own boots, the paired impressions of the dog's paws leading to the ute. The ground out here keeps its records faithfully. It had kept all of his, and yet it had kept none of whoever else had been there. David is not a man who reaches for the supernatural. He has a rational mind and a working knowledge of remote Queensland, and he has spent a long time, years now, trying to build an explanation that fits what he found. An explanation that accounts for the butts, and accounts for the absence, and accounts for the slow, deliberate closing of distance through the night while he sat there by his dying fire, with his dog and his rifle. And he hasn't built one. And I think that's the thing that stayed with me since I first heard this particular account. Because there's no box for it. If there'd been footprints, there's a story, a person, a reason, a threat you can name. If there'd been nothing at all, no butts, no smell, it fades into a strange night and a nervous man, and perhaps a trick of the light. But this sits between those two things and refuses to budge either way. Physical evidence of presence, physical impossibility of arrival or escape. Someone was there, someone watched, someone smoked and waited and got closer and left no trace of how they'd achieved that. Goes without saying, but David has not camped alone on that station since.